Okay, so I'm kind of a fish out of water here as a Latin Americanist. I specialize primarily on Venezuela, although I dabble with other countries in Latin America and the US Latinx literature. So a lot of your references are not very well known to me. And I wrote a presentation that wouldn't have a whole lot of references that wouldn't be unknown to you. So, but initially, a lot of the material that I was gonna use as examples were literary works engaging with infrastructure and its failures, especially in the context of Venezuela. But I decided to shift my focus after recent events, all of them which happened just this month, and it's only what, the 10th day, 11th day of the month? So I will instead trace how oil and infrastructure relate to an uptick of Venezuelan migration to the United States in 2022 that's been sensationalized in a lot of ways. The estimated number of Venezuelans in the United States is under 1 million. Maybe some people say it's about 700,000 to maybe about 1 million, which is small percentage of the Venezuelan diaspora itself, and it's also a very small number of the, 18% of US Americans that are Latinos, or of the immigrant population of the United States. It's really a small group that has become scapegoated in the United States. And I have a personal stake in all of this, not only because I am an academic specialist in Venezuela, but I am a Venezuelan immigrant, although I've been in the United States now for most of my life. And so, the first event that shifted my focus was the Supreme Court's decision last week authorizing the removal of temporary protected status from roughly 1/3 of all Venezuelans living in the United States. And with that, plus, here's that piece of news, plus the removal of humanitarian parole, about 66% of all Venezuelans in the United States are gonna go from having some kind of papers to being undocumented, in the context of everything that's happening right now with ICE and all of that. And then the second event that after it happened, I was like, well, I'm not really gonna talk about literature, I'm gonna talk about migration as it relates to infrastructure. It was the raid in a Chicago apartment building where a lot of Venezuelans lived, and it was very militarized with helicopters and like men jumping into the building and breaking into the apartments. And their excuse for doing that is that the Venezuelans living in that apartment building are part of the Tren de Aragua gang, and which was then also the same pretext used earlier this year to invoke the Alien Enemies Act and send 238 Venezuelans to endure 4 months of torture in El Salvador, right? And so here I have some of the news pieces, again, just from last week, just from October 2025. And so before getting to the topic of infrastructure failure and migration, though, I want to share some of the materials that are no longer part of this talk. And I just created a QR code. I was gonna add links to that document. I still will later this weekend. Right now it's just a Google Doc with a list of literary works translated from Spanish into English and available in the United States. These are contemporary works of Venezuelan literature that do deal with infrastructure and migration. And also a couple of movies. And so hopefully this will serve as a nudge to all of you to read some Venezuelan literature. Venezuela is kind of the very understudied even within Latin American studies and Latin American literature. So setting that aside, I'm gonna turn to 2 narratives about infrastructure and the fossil economy. The first is a narrative of stability, predictability, and what we learn to ignore. Right. Infrastructure, classically, is designed to recede into the background over time. It becomes what is expected. The lights will turn on, water will flow from the faucet, your local supermarket will have produce kept by refrigeration. This creates what Jennifer Wenzel calls a fiction of stability. Right, a sense of continuity that we rely on, that we need to have in order to be able to make plans, right? You can trust that the contents of your fridge will be kept cool and safe to eat at dinner time. You trust that the road will be there and functional enough for you to drive wherever you need to go. And so infrastructure, in a sense, makes you feel self-sufficient, makes you feel like an independent subject who gets to make the decision to go somewhere, to fly somewhere, to eat this thing and not that other thing. But if you dig deeper, this is also a story of environmental control and domination, right? To make the biosphere itself create within the biosphere itself a world that suits human demands. Right, and so it's to remain cool in the tropics, to remain illuminated at nighttime, and for it to feel like it's your choice, right? To turn on the lights and to turn them off, for example. And so, right, you can make these decisions by simply pressing a button with no physical labor to create the instantaneous sensorial transformation that infrastructure makes possible, and right, fossil fuels make possible. And here's an ad from 1949 of Union Carbide, which at the very top reads, "He that invents a machine augments the power of man." Right, and this optimism over the many things that could now be made possible through fossil fuel technology and infrastructure infiltrated governmental, educational, and economic institutions throughout much of the world. The belief that societies had at last achieved the power to liberate themselves from natural, material, or geographical constraints became a premise of corporate research and development, of economic and political policy, and implicitly of cultural institutions themselves. And we can most palpably see these ideas in mid-century marketing materials, so I'm just going to show a couple of examples. Right, here's the Shell oil ad, "Climate in a Cage," which praises the agricultural revolution made possible by petrochemicals, and the ad copy explains that this caged climate will soon be tailored to order. And obviously, this feels very different today than how it might have felt in 1945. And here is another example from a General Motors documentary, To New Horizons, which is available on YouTube. And at some point, they're showing these highways and cars, and the voiceover narration says, "Over space, man has begun to win his victory," right? To describe the infrastructure, fossil fuels, the technology that's making this world possible. And all of these materials, the marketing of the mid-20th century, frequently depicted scientists, laboratories, engineers, reassuring 20th century publics that it's not the alchemist or the magician or the businessman or the confidence man or even the politician who is responsible for the magic of fossil fuels, oil in particular, and of infrastructure. It was instead the engineers and the scientists. And as such, the public could rest assured in the viability of these grand promises as objective scientific facts unsullied by politics and ideology, because it's the scientists who are telling you this. And I very often, very frequently, when I talk about Venezuela, bring up marketing materials from the United States, because there's a strand of thought within Venezuela that Venezuela failed because of a flaw within Venezuelan culture, right? If I were to summarize it, is that Venezuelans just didn't know what to do with modernity. They were not good moderns, and therefore that's why the country finds itself in its current situation. And I always foreground this, even in my writing for Venezuelans, as a reminder that these dreams of the great things that fossil fuels and oil would do for societies, for humanity, this was not something that was unique to Venezuela. This was very much what the metropolitan centers of the fossil fuel economy were telling the world. And so now, let's explore how these fantastical dreams of technology and infrastructure impacted Venezuela in particular. So Venezuela began the 20th century as the poorest country in South America, as it had not fully recovered from spending much of the 19th century fighting a series of wars. And oil was found in this devastated country in 1914. By 1925, oil was the country's main economic activity, and at several points in the mid-20th century, Venezuela was the largest oil exporter in the world. And now the Venezuelan government loves to tell everyone that will listen that Venezuela has the largest deposits of oil in the world. This combination of factors, right, the devastated country that finds oil, meant that Venezuela's infrastructure and institutions and population growth have all been intricately tied to oil infrastructure, to the oil industry, and to oil money. But beyond money, right, governments in Venezuela fully internalized a vision of society where every problem could be solved with technology, with something new, with something spectacular. And this is an idea that has persisted regardless of what type of government the country has had in the last century or so. So all of this takes us to the other side of the infrastructure narrative of stability and predictability, which is that of infrastructure as spectacle, be it as that of the nation's grandness, as was the case with Venezuela, or now as that of its catastrophic failure. To exemplify these ideas, let me tell you a little bit about some of the Venezuelans in my life. Some of my older relatives, right, like aunts and uncles, talk frequently to this day about roads, bridges, one particular water dam, cable cars, built mostly, although not exclusively, in the mid-20th century. To them, these grand infrastructure projects are examples of what a great country Venezuela was meant to be. And there's even a whole genre of social media accounts devoted to showcasing the grand infrastructural miracles of mid-20th century Venezuela, with comment after comment expressing nostalgia for that past when Venezuela was rich and a promising nation. That this interest in an imagery of spectacular infrastructure lingers is in no small part the result of all the marketing devoted to promoting the grandness of Venezuela in the mid-20th century, like this Time magazine cover from 1955. Some of this PR came from oil companies trying to stay on good terms with the state. The rest came from the state itself. The dictator you see right there used some oil money to hire firms like McCann Erickson of Mad Men fame, since Mad Men got brought up earlier, right, to sell an image of a modern, prosperous Venezuela. And one of the strategies, right, was to have like magazine covers of just the beauty of the country. And then during the Cold War, the US also embraced that story because Venezuela was proof that working with US and British oil companies could make a Latin American nation, quote unquote, first world, right? Like that was a lot of this marketing at the time projected that Venezuela would be the first developed nation of what was then called the third world. And so here, right, in this 55 Time magazine cover, we see the kind of the brutal dictator of the time, and behind, right, the oil, the tropical landscape, but also, right, the buildings, the infrastructure, this fantastical dreams that oil was making possible for Venezuela. And then inside the magazine, we see, right, like these pictures of the building boom in Caracas and the modern art in the newly built university. And I was going to show you a video, but for technical reasons, I'm not going to be able to show it, but where they talk about the building of these futuristic highways, and they use that word to talk about the highway and the buildings of Caracas in the mid-1950s. And so one crucial way to think about all of this, right, because I do think in outside Venezuela, in cultural memory, people have forgotten this vision of Venezuela. Right, this is kind of akin to the kind of imagery we see today in the marketing around places like Dubai or Saudi Arabia's Project 2030 and the line, this like futuristic but completely sustainable city that they're going to build in the middle of the desert. Right, and all of this, right, is they are visual, concrete, and easily translatable manifestations of a deeper problem that's harder to see, right, which is modes of governance built on the fantasy that the latest, most flamboyant technological development could solve all of society's ills, often by conquering nature and geography in the process. And I forgot to go to the next, right here, I have a juxtaposition of when they built a Sheraton hotel in Venezuela and then the Marriott in Dubai, right? And, the discourse, mid-century Venezuela and present-day Dubai is very similar, the way they talk about these places. And now I lost my place. right, so visual examples of this, like conquering of nature and geography. And these projects look like a form of long-term planning. But in reality, they really are more of a spectacular form of advertising, these grand dreams, because what actually happened with long-term planning projects like sewage systems, water treatment plants, things that are not really spectacular, that you're not gonna put them in an ad. Well, that then takes us to the next story of what happened in Venezuela. Whereas regime after regime, there's been this political culture that saw the slower work of repair and of long-term care as secondary to innovation. As Venezuelan historian Maria Sol Perez Chael puts it, Venezuela became a nation perpetually stuck in an inaugural ritual, constantly laying the first foundational stone. An idea echoed by the optimism of a 1950s governmental official who claimed that the majority of Venezuela's problems can be solved by engineering. And now I'm gonna jump, right? Like the idea that I'm gonna jump in time, but the idea here is forms of governance that are so focused on building the brand new thing that then repair gets set aside. So I'm gonna go to the early 21st century. During the last commodity booms in the early 2000s, Venezuela suddenly has the most money it's ever had, and it again went on a construction boom. It also funded a lot of social programs, but it also became state policy to disinvest in existing institutions and in infrastructure needing repair and maintenance. Funding was pulled from several ongoing repair and maintenance projects to instead build brand new and improved versions, right? Versions of either institutions that were now more ideologically pure in its staffing, or just the new dam, the new road, the new bridge that will replace the one was there already. This came to be branded as a revolution, and a left-wing revolution is what much of the world saw. But what didn't get as widely seen was the severe neglect caused by this bifurcation of institutions, as existing hospitals, universities, roads, pipelines, hydroelectric dams stopped receiving the funds needed for their reproduction, repair, and maintenance. The revolution's fixation on inaugurating new projects over maintaining existing ones repeated the very logic I began with, right? Innovation over repair. It's the same petro thinking that once promised stability and spectacle, but first the tragedy of capitalism and then as farcical socialism. This neglect was not entirely felt until the commodity boom ended and the new and improved roads, dams, and clinics were left unfinished, and as infrastructure began massively failing in the mid-2010s. And so this takes us to Venezuela after the commodity boom. So I'm gonna start first with the oil company, and then I'm gonna jump to food, and there is a logical connection there. So the mass firing of oil workers from the state-owned company PDVSA in 2002 meant that the company suddenly found itself without the technicians who knew how to carry out maintenance, and many of them were never replaced to this day. The lack of maintenance to the extractive infrastructure helps create the conditions for a massive fall in oil and petrochemical production, which some of us here, myself included, in most contexts, would usually see as a good thing. But on the ground, it meant something else, especially as industrial accidents and oil spills started to dramatically increase. Petróleos de Venezuela, the state oil company, self-reported more than 46,000 oil spills between 2010 and 2016, at which point they stopped reporting them altogether. But Watch Group says that they've been increasing even more. And fisherman Samuel Ortiz puts it plainly. The spills killed our job, our fishing ground, and the shrimp farms. The spills are punching us on the stomach and on the pockets. And environmental watchwoman Elsa Rodriguez added, the spills keep happening. Every year, they're more frequent. It doesn't just hurt the wildlife, but also the local fishermen. So that's the ecological side of this. But then, kind of what's wild about this lack of repair and maintenance is that this really hurt Petróleos de Venezuela itself, as well as the state, because they no longer could produce enough oil to, well, carry their normal activities as a state-owned company and as an oil company. And so this lack of maintenance severely diminished oil extraction and production, and Venezuela was no longer able to export the same amount of oil as it once did, but national production of gasoline, kerosene, lubricants, synthetic pesticides, and fertilizers also collapsed, leading to severe shortages. This had a massive impact on food production, a problem that in truth began with the Venezuelan economy 80 years earlier. And so very briefly, how did it begin? Started in the 1920s, as Venezuela was laying its first roads and bridges and the oil economy was growing. There was a slow abandonment of agriculture, which is a super complex story, but one key factor there is that it was cheaper to import food than to grow it. And then over time, farming in Venezuela, as in much of the world, this is not confined to Venezuela, also became dependent on synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, another legacy of the fossil economy. So you have this country that, in part because of the oil economy, no longer produces that much food, and then the little food that it produces requires synthetic fertilizers and pesticides that are petrochemicals, and suddenly those are no longer there. The Venezuelan state no longer produces them. And then there's also a shortage of fuel. And so we have the story here from 2016 of farmers essentially having their crops rot in the region where they were grown because they couldn't transport them somewhere else to the cities, essentially, in the country. So here's a picture of, you only see 3, but it was 150 cars waited outside a closed gas station for 6 days in one of the main producers of potato in Venezuela, and then most of those potatoes eventually just rotted. They weren't able to make it to their destination. And so my own middle and upper middle class family members, with the financial support of their relatives in the diaspora, would have to travel 7 hours to Colombia each way to get groceries for several years, right? And this was a reality for a lot of Venezuelans, that they either had to literally go to another country to get food or figure out creative ways to find food, and often they didn't find food. Because also, on top of all of this, the government no longer had the money to import food as it had in the past. And so then, lack of maintenance of water and electric infrastructure also was another element of this complete disrepair of the country's infrastructure. So for over a decade now, blackouts are a daily occurrence everywhere in the country except for Caracas, because Caracas is too politically important to let it experience blackouts too frequently. And according to engineers and civil servants who have spoken on the matter, the degree of the crisis was in large measure the result of that lack of maintenance that I keep returning to, as well as the fact that several projects to build dams and electric plants were abandoned when the projects ran out of money after the last fiscal boom. Right? And so all of this also exacerbates the food crisis, because then people can't refrigerate food. And so all of these infrastructural failures are multifaceted crises that I have to simplify to keep this within 20 minutes, right? And they cannot be linearly explained in terms of the single cause, but there are 2 pieces of this larger puzzle that are relevant to this talk. First, the depth of the crisis was in some measure preventable. Venezuela is not particularly arid. It's got good soils. With proper management, access to water, electricity, and food did not have to become so precarious at this point of the 21st century. I'm not saying that they wouldn't have had problems with those things at this point in the 20th century, but it didn't have to get this bad. Secondly, the fact that the country's infrastructure could have been managed but was not exposes a pattern in which the promise of technological spectacle outweighed for so long the attention to basic ongoing work that keeps infrastructure and society functioning. So no water, no electricity, no food, the highest rate of inflation in the world a few years ago, an increasingly repressive government that very effectively squashes protests. What do people do when faced with all of that? They migrate, right? And that's very much what they did. And even this from a year ago, Venezuela's power blackouts are fueling a surge in migration. And so an estimated 7.8 million people fled Venezuela in the 2010s and 2020s, which is 25.55% of Venezuela's 2015 population, which is roughly the percentage of Irish folk who left the island during the Great Famine. And this is a shocking statistic, right? A quarter of the population of a country abandons their home. And it's shocking not simply because of the sheer human suffering that accompanies it, but also because Venezuela is not a besieged colony. There was no big drought. There was no major natural disaster. There was no war that led to this, right? Other factors like sanctions and whatever else exacerbated it, but the crisis began before all of that. People left because daily life in the midst of failed infrastructure became impossible. And again, as I said in the beginning, I should add that only a very small percentage of the people who left Venezuela came to the United States. The vast majority of them are in Colombia and in Peru. And the situation in Venezuela is extreme, and everything about Venezuela in the last century has been pretty extreme. But it is crucial to see that these catastrophes that I have described in this presentation are not an aberration, but the worst logical outcome of ways of thinking that enabled by fossil-fueled economies. An intense and extreme version of our collective vulnerability as we live in a world thoroughly shaped by our institutions' faith in endless innovation, spectacle, and technical fixes. The Venezuelan migrant is not simply fleeing a petrostate, but the ruins of both narratives that oil built. The promise of stability that failed and the spectacle of great prosperity that ultimately did not last. To call the Venezuelan migrant crisis an oil crisis, then, is to recognize migration as the afterlife of the fossil fuel dream. The displacement produced when the infrastructures and imaginations that oil once sustained finally collapse. Thank you.